Hi friends, I trust that you're doing good. I hope you've had a good week. You might remember that last week we started a new series called Beautiful One, and we've been asking this question: why is Jesus the most compelling person and also the most divisive person in history? Last Sunday we had such a good conversation around this topic at our Sunday gathering. And today we're going to talk about something that made Jesus extremely divisive, and that was his anti-establishment message. And we'll get back to that in just a second. But I want to begin by asking, have you heard the term deconstructing faith, or have you heard of a person who has deconstructed their faith? There are many people today who are taking a fresh look at the spiritual foundation, things that they've grown up accepting and believing for their whole life, taking a fresh look at that and coming to some very different conclusions. The term deconstructing your faith refers to a systematic evaluation or a systematic deconstruction of things that we've grown up, accepting and believing. I read this week that sociologists say that about 44%, that's pretty specific actually, 44% of people will go through some kind of a major spiritual transformation in their life. 44%. Now that can be moving, towards Jesus, or it can be moving away from Jesus and the church, or it can be, transitioning from other religions to or from, but 44% of people will have some sort of a major spiritual transformation in their life. And so when we're talking about deconstructing faith and talking about people, taking a fresh look at Jesus and the church, a question that comes up for me is why? Why are so many people really reevaluating, what they've always believed in Jesus and the church and everything? And I think that part of it, I don't have all the answers certainly, but I think that part of it is just a coming of age thing where people, you grow up in Sunday school and you just accept what you were told and you accept that as normal. And then they come of age and they start to question for themselves and think for themselves and come to different conclusions. Sometimes, deconstructing our faith can be precipitated by some kind of a major life event. Could be trauma, or it could be some other major life event. But quite often, people deconstructing their faith is a result of looking at the church and not liking what they see. And people who talk about this is a fairly common theme, looking at the church and what it's become and not liking what they see. So they'll talk about things like power dynamics and abuse of power, and talk about things like past abuses, residential schools, or the church's track record on treatment of people in the LGBTQ plus community. Or maybe they'll refer to theological positions, biblical positions that seem out of touch with with today's world, with the modern world, right? But listen, here's the thing: many people are taking a fresh look at the church, and they don't like what they see. And I'd like to throw out a question here, and I'm actually going to come back to this question at the end of our time together. Here's my question. If Jesus were to show up in person physically today and give a critique, give a critique of the North American church, something similar to what he did in the book of Revelation, chapter 2 and 3. He gave a critique of different churches. If Jesus were to show up today and give a critique of the North American church, what would he have to say? What would Jesus affirm in what he sees today in the North American church? And what would Jesus criticize? And so I'd like to just kind of, park that question for a moment, maybe give you a bit of time to think about it, and we'll come back to it in just a moment. But I think it's very interesting that the religious system that Jesus arrived at 2,000 years ago when he came to earth, in bodily form, the religious system that he arrived at had had similarities to the religious system that we see today. And Jesus was very divisive. Like I said at the beginning, he was very divisive because of his anti-establishment message. He did not put up with I was going to say, he didn't put up with stuff that that others did, right? Jesus called it out, and he didn't put up with it. Let me give you a couple examples. Jesus criticized the religious system for not helping people in crisis. In Luke chapter 10, verses, whatever the verses are, but Jesus told the story. He was talking to a religious leader, and he told the story of a good Samaritan, right? We all know the story well. So as the story goes, a guy's on the road. He gets robbed and beaten and left beside the road, right? Beaten and bloodied. First two people that come along are two religious people, a religious, I should have written it down, but two religious people. I think it was a priest and a Levite, or a priest and an assistant in the temple. Those two religious people come along and they go to the other side of the street. They ignore the guy who needs help. And then the third person to come along, of course, is a Samaritan who was looked down on, by the religious people. And the Samaritan was, of course, the one who helped Jesus, right? And the point was very clear that your religion is worthless if you're not willing to help people in crisis. Now, friends, I'd like to actually just pause here for a moment and make a point. And this may be the most important thing that I have to say today. Don't tell me what you're against. Tell me what you're for. Don't tell me what you're against. Tell me what you're for. So it's so easy. It's super easy for us to pick apart, problems in a person or an organization or in the church. It's so easy for us to pick apart and say, see, the church totally sucks because of this, this, and this, right? Don't tell me what you're against. Tell me what you're for. And by Jesus telling this story, part of it was a criticism, certainly, to the religious system of the day. But Jesus was placing a high value on helping people who find themselves in crisis, right? And so don't tell me what you're against, tell me what you're for. So my the thinking behind talking about this today is not to say, oh, the church is the worst because of this, this, and this. My heart and in my mind is, let's identify what we're for. Let's identify the weaknesses and where we've fallen down, but what are we for, okay? So that's why, as a community of faith at Reunion Stouffville, we invest heavily, both in money and in manpower, in Restore. Restore is our way of helping people in crisis in our local community, right? And Restore is one of our three main organizations that we support. We support Daughter Project, helping young girls who are in crisis. We support Nepal Peace Project, helping children who are in crisis, right? So we're just now moving towards sponsoring another refugee family from Afghanistan. And so Jesus was saying, your religion is worthless if you're not willing to help people in crisis. And I'm saying that our community is worthless. Our community of faith, Reunion, is worthless if we're not willing to help people in crisis. Okay? Let's move on and look at some other areas that Jesus criticized. Criticize the religious system. As Jesus was getting close to going to the cross and his crucifixion, Jesus made one last trip to Jerusalem. And this last trip to Jerusalem was very intentional. Jesus, the Old Testament says, he set his face like a flint. He was very deliberate in moving towards the cross on this last trip. He was very deliberate, very intentional. And we see on this last trip into Jerusalem that Jesus pushed the buttons. I said last week in our conversation that he stuck his finger in the eye of the religious system and had a lot to say and was very anti-establishment in things that he said. It begins in Matthew 21. Matthew 21, the story of when Jesus overturned the tables of people who were selling stuff let me just read it, verses 12 and 13. Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out all the people buying and selling animals for sacrifice. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. He said to them, "The scriptures declare," listen to this, "my temple will be called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." My temple will be called a house of prayer, a place where people come to connect with God, but you've turned it into a den of thieves, right? Jesus was very, then verse 15 says the religious leaders were indignant because, people were worshiping Jesus. Jesus was making a big statement at the very beginning here and was very critical of those who really were exploiting and getting rich off people's desire to worship, people's desire to connect with God, right? And I'm sorry to say that we can see some of that, in the North American church today. Then Jesus went on in Matthew 23. He gave the series of criticism, anti-establishment statements against, in Matthew 23, verses 3 and 13, he talked about hypocrites who don't practice what they preach. So verse 3, Matthew 23, verse 3, so practice and obey, whatever the religious leaders tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. And then verse 13, what sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, with an exclamation mark, for you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, right? So Jesus is just right out there. And hey, this really speaks to me as somebody who is a spiritual guide, a spiritual leader. I have to really pay attention to this. Am I living out the things, and I'm talking to myself, am I living out the things that we talk about, right? And those words are directly pointed at me and other pastors. Then Jesus talked in Matthew 23, verse 5, about spiritual pride. Everything they do is for show. On their arms, they wear extra wide prayer boxes with scripture verses inside, and they wear robes with extra long tassels. They love to sit at the head of the table at banquets and in seats of honor in the synagogues. They love to receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplace and to be called rabbi, Spiritual pride. Spiritual pride. How relevant is that today? Going on, Matthew 23, verse 23, he criticized those who ignore showing justice, mercy, and faith. Verse 23, what sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites. There he says it again. For you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the most important aspects of the law: justice, mercy, and faith, right? You're all about this other stuff, these man-made things that God never intended, and you forget about justice, mercy, and faith. And then just one more in Matthew 24, Jesus talked about he showed very little regard for religious buildings, right? In Matthew 24, verse 1, as Jesus was leaving the temple grounds, his disciples pointed out to him, the various temple buildings, and they're very impressive because we just a couple of weeks ago stood, and saw the stones from Herod's wall. But Jesus responded, do you see these buildings? I tell you the truth, they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. And this was a very divisive thing for Jesus to say. He's just like, whatever, like the buildings just don't matter, right? And that's the temple that he was talking about. So there's an interesting conversation there. But listen, my point is this. that Jesus came with a very anti-establishment message. But it wasn't anti-establishment, but it wasn't what he was against, it was what he was for, you see? I'd like to make just a couple of quick observations before we wrap up. First of all, I see a very clear distinction between Jesus and his bride, the church, and the man-made institutions that we've created around Jesus and his bride, the church, right? I see a very clear distinction. And quite often we see Jesus do the exact same thing. He talked about the law of God, and he said, obey the law, but don't listen to all those man-made things. I forget which verse that was in Matthew. But Jesus drew a distinction between God and his law, or Jesus and his church, and the man-made stuff, right? So in my mind, I see a very clear distinction. My second observation is that deconstruction is not inherently bad. Deconstructing our faith is not inherently bad. In fact, I read a book a little while ago by Susan Bessie, I should remember that, but it's called Out of Bounds. And she, Mrs. Bessie, I'll call her because I can't remember her first name, she went through a crisis of faith, really, and she deconstructed many of the things. But it's a great book because she comes out the other side with better clarity and stronger faith, right? And so questioning things that we've grown up with and deconstructing our faith is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's messy. I think it's always messy in the middle. But when we come out with a better, stronger, clearer faith, it's actually a good thing. My final observation is this. Did you know that approximately every 500 years, the church goes through a major transition? That's not even really a good word, but a major reconstruction every 500 years. Mark Dyer, who's an Anglican bishop, he put it in these words: about every 500 years, the church feels compelled to hold a giant rummage sale. And so if we quickly trace the history of the church, in the first century, the church was born, of course, the New Testament church. In the 4th century, Constantine came to faith, and Constantine really organized the church. He built these beautiful buildings, and he turned the church into something that it was not in the 1st century, right? So 1st century, the church is born. 4th century, Constantine organized the church. 6th century, so just a couple hundred years later on that one, was the fall of the Roman Empire and the dawn of the Dark Ages. And then skip ahead 500 years to the 11th century, roughly 500 years, to the 11th century, which was the Great Schism, the division between East and West, the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And then in the 16th century, roughly 500 years later, was the Great Reformation, with Martin Luther and the Wittenberg Door and all that, the birth of the Protestant Church in the 16th century, and here we are in the 21st century. And friends, I wonder, I'm not saying anything this, but I wonder, and I've heard a few people wonder, if we're in the middle of a significant transition in the church, and if and it's not just one or two people, it's many people in our culture today who are reevaluating, and they don't like what they see in the church. And I just wonder if we're in the middle of some kind of a significant change in the church's history. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, let me quickly, oh man, I've gone long today, and I'm sorry for that. Let me just quickly throw out 3 questions that we'll talk about on Sunday. First one we talked about earlier. If Jesus appeared among us and gave a critique of the North American church, like he did in Revelation 2 and 3, what do you think he would say? What would he affirm? What would he rebuke? Second question, what do you think about people deconstructing their faith? here's the big part of it, where do you see Jesus in that process? And then the third question, have there been times that you have re-examined your position? What parts of the church institution rub you the wrong way? And again, what do you think Jesus would say about those things? Okay, so again on Sunday, I'm so looking forward to this conversation. I think it's going to be just really, really meaningful. And so look forward to seeing you. If you can, look forward to seeing you on Sunday at Latcham Hall at 10 o'clock. Okay, bless you friends. Have a fantastic day.